It was early August of 2013 when I decided to take a week off and go camping alone in northern Idaho. I was 34 at the time, working a stressful job in Boise. I didn't have kids or much tying me down, so when work gave us some time off, I packed up and headed out without much of a plan. I wanted to be somewhere remote, away from everything. No phones, no traffic, no noise, just trees, water, sky. That was the idea anyway. I drove about 6 hours north, past Coeur d'Alene, and then east into the forested region near the Canadian border. I'd read online about a few places with dispersed camping near the Panhandle National Forest, and I was aiming for one of them. I had an old printed map and a GPS that barely worked that far out. My truck was loaded up with everything I thought I'd need: tent, stove, extra gas, a cooler full of food, and a .38 I usually kept in the glove box. It took longer than I expected to find a good spot. A few of the roads I tried were blocked by fallen trees or just didn't go anywhere. Eventually, I found a clearing off a dirt road that sloped down into a narrow valley. There was no one else around for miles, at least that's how it seemed. The trees were thick, mostly fir and pine, and the sound of the wind moving through them had that deep, hollow sound you only get when you're way out there. The clearing was maybe 50 yards wide, with a gentle stream running along the far edge. It looked like someone had camped there before. There was a half-burnt fire ring and some old rusted beer cans scattered around. I spent the rest of the day setting up camp. I pitched my tent in the flattest spot near the edge of the clearing, with the back facing the woods and the front facing the stream. I set up a small cooking area about 10 feet away with a fold-out table and a couple of chairs. I gathered some wood for a fire and had a simple dinner of canned chili and bread. That first night was quiet. I sat by the fire until about 10, just listening to the forest and trying to settle into the silence. It took a while to shake the city out of my head. Even out there, I caught myself checking my phone for a signal every once in a while, even though I knew there wouldn't be one. When I finally climbed into my sleeping bag, the air was cool and still. I slept straight through, only waking up once when I thought I heard something outside. It was probably just a deer or maybe the wind shifting the trees. The next morning, I made some coffee over the fire and walked up the ridge behind the campsite. The trail wasn't marked, but I followed what looked like a game path. The higher I climbed, the better the view got. From the top, I could see across the valley. It was just trees and sky in every direction. I stayed up there for a while, just sitting on a fallen log, trying to enjoy the stillness. The second night, I slept a little lighter. I kept hearing noises I couldn't place. Snapping twigs, something rustling the brush, what might have been footsteps near the edge of the clearing. Every time I unzipped the tent and looked out, there was nothing. No animals, no movement, just dark trees and stars. I chalked it up to paranoia. I wasn't used to being that alone, and my mind was probably filling in blanks. On the third day, I hiked a few miles up an old logging road I'd seen on the map. It was overgrown and half washed out, but it led to a beautiful spot, an old fire lookout tower that had collapsed years ago. The trail was lined with wildflowers, and I took a bunch of photos on my cheap digital camera. I stayed out longer than I should have and made it back just before dusk. When I got to camp, I noticed something small that didn't sit right. The folding chair I'd left open was knocked over. I didn't remember leaving it like that, but I figured maybe the wind had done it. Still, I felt something off. I didn't light a fire that night. I sat in the tent and read for a while by lantern light, then lay there with my ears tuned to every noise outside. Around midnight, I heard a heavy thump from the woods, then another, then silence. I lay there frozen, listening so hard it hurt my head. After about an hour, I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, I walked around the perimeter of the clearing. I looked for tracks or signs of animals, anything that might explain what I heard. I didn't find much, just some flattened grass near the edge where something big might have stood for a while. Could have been a moose or even a bear, but no tracks, no droppings, nothing. That day, I stayed close to camp. I fished in the stream a bit, caught one small trout, and cooked it up for lunch. That afternoon, as I was cleaning up, I found something in the brush about 20 feet from my tent. It was a single work glove, faded red with black trim, the kind you'd buy at any hardware store. It wasn't mine. I hadn't brought gloves like that. It was damp and full of dirt, like it had been there a while, but not so long that it had broken down. I turned it over a few times, then tossed it aside, thinking maybe a hunter had lost it months ago. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I didn't even try. I sat in the tent with the lantern on low and my .38 resting next to my sleeping bag. The forest was silent, too silent. It didn't feel like wind or wildlife. It felt like something was holding its breath. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something move in the brush again. Not fast, not panicked, just slow and steady. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and looked out. The fire ring was still cold. The chairs were upright, but near the edge of the clearing, between 2 trees, I saw movement. Figure, I think. Not an animal. It didn't move like one. Stood still, watching or listening. I couldn't see a face or any details, just a silhouette against the deeper darkness of the trees. I froze. For 10, maybe 20 minutes, it didn't move. Then, just as slowly as it had appeared, it stepped backward into the trees and was gone. I didn't sleep. I waited for daylight. As soon as the sun started to come up, I packed up what I could and drove out of there. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just threw everything in the back of the truck and left. I didn't care if I left some stuff behind. I drove until I hit pavement, and then I drove another 100 miles south before stopping at a gas station. While filling up, I walked inside and grabbed a coffee. I asked the guy behind the counter if he'd heard about any missing people in the area or weird stuff in the woods. He gave me a look like I was asking the wrong kind of question. Said people get lost out there all the time, especially hunters and hikers who go in alone. Some make it out, some don't. I didn't tell him what I saw. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. But I know what I saw wasn't an animal. I know I wasn't imagining that glove or the figure in the trees. I went back once, 2 years later, just to check the place out. I didn't camp. I just parked at the trailhead and hiked in. The clearing looked the same, but someone had set up a makeshift blind up on the ridge. Sticks lashed together with twine, a flattened patch of earth behind it. It looked recent. No one else was around. I left after 10 minutes. Since then, I haven't gone camping alone. I still hike sometimes, but only on marked trails. I stay close to people near towns. I still carry the .38 too, just in case. It's hard to explain what it was that scared me the most. Not the glove, not the figure, not even the noise. It was the silence. That hollow, watching silence. Like whatever was out there wasn't afraid of me at all. Like it had seen people like me before, and knew I'd leave before I found out what it really was. Back in 2014, I was 27, single, and going through one of those stretches where I felt stuck and restless. I had just quit a job I hated, packed my things into storage, and decided to spend some time reconnecting with nature. One of the places I always wanted to explore was the desert outside Flagstaff, Arizona. I grew up in Colorado and did plenty of hiking and camping, but the open desert always felt like some mysterious place I had never fully appreciated. I wasn't aiming for anything extreme. I wasn't trying to prove a point or test my limits. I just wanted to be alone, walk during the day, camp under the stars, and reset my mind. My plan was simple. Drive down to the Kaibab National Forest just south of the Grand Canyon, spend 3 nights solo camping in dispersed areas, and move on. I brought my tent, a sleeping pad, my old Army surplus pack, a 9mm handgun I had for emergencies, water containers, and enough food for about 5 days. I also had a basic GPS, a paper map, and a backup power bank for my phone. I'd done solo camping before in Colorado, Utah, and Montana. Nothing ever weird happened. I didn't expect anything different this time. I drove out of Flagstaff early on a Tuesday morning in October. The air was sharp and dry, maybe 45 degrees. I had looked at some dispersed camping spots near Forest Road 320, way off the main highways. The area had a mix of pines, low scrubland, rocky patches, and miles of flat terrain. You could walk for hours and not see anyone. I pulled off a dusty side road and drove another half-mile until the ruts in the ground told me to stop. I parked, loaded up my pack, and hiked about another mile to get away from any chance of another car showing up. I didn't even pitch the tent right away. I just sat for a while, leaning against a tree, listening. Nothing. That quiet was why I came. I walked around to get my bearings. There were some old tire tracks off in the distance that looked faded, maybe weeks old. There was a small ridge about a quarter-mile away, and behind that, just a wide, flat stretch of brush and rock, all the way to the horizon. You couldn't really ask for a more peaceful place to camp. That first night was completely normal. I made some instant rice and beans, boiled water for tea, and sat with my back to a pine tree until it got dark. I didn't light a fire, partly because I didn't want to attract attention, partly because I liked the dark. The stars were unreal, the kind of sky you can only get in the middle of nowhere. When I laid down, I heard the wind pushing through the brush, a few creaks from the trees, and some far-off animal calls, probably coyotes. I fell asleep without trouble. Sometime during the night, I woke up to what I thought was footsteps, not walking, more like pacing. The sound was soft, inconsistent, crunching lightly on dry ground. I laid still. I figured it might be a deer or even a cow. There were cattle out here sometimes. I didn't move or unzip the tent, just listened. After maybe 5 minutes, the sound stopped. I waited another 10, didn't hear anything else, and went back to sleep. The next morning, I found a few tracks near my tent. Definitely not hooves. They looked like human shoe prints. Big ones, boots maybe, but they weren't clear enough to guess more than that. It struck me as odd. Who the hell would be walking around my site in the middle of the night? I tried not to overthink it. Maybe someone was camping nearby and just got turned around. Still, I made a mental note. After breakfast, I packed up my stuff and hiked about 3 miles further northwest. No trails, no signs, no other cars in sight. Just a lot of open land and some dry washes cutting through the terrain. The second site felt better, more open, fewer trees, but with some large boulders I could use for cover. I pitched the tent between two of them, where I'd be sheltered from wind but still have a view of the flatlands beyond. I ate a cold lunch, drank plenty of water, and walked for a couple hours, circling back to my tent before dusk. That night, things felt different. It wasn't one specific thing, just a growing unease I couldn't shake. Maybe it was the wind, or how quiet everything got after dark. I skipped the tea and sat with my headlamp off, just watching the horizon, listening. Around midnight, the pacing came back. It was faint but familiar. Crunch. Pause. 2 more steps. Stop. It wasn't a 4-legged rhythm. It sounded like someone trying not to be noticed. The steps circled my tent from maybe 30 feet out, then went quiet. I laid completely still. I didn't even reach for my gun. I didn't want whoever or whatever was out there to know I was awake. Minutes passed. Then I heard the sound again, closer this time. The steps were heavier, slow, deliberate, not confident, careful. Then nothing. I stayed awake until the sun started to rise. When I unzipped the tent and stepped out, I looked around immediately. There were more tracks now, this time clearer. The ground was dry, but a thin layer of dust had caught some heel and toe marks. They were definitely human. I counted at least 12 different prints, all from the same direction. They came from the open land behind my tent, looped around the boulders, then disappeared again. Still no boot lugs or shoe treads, just smooth impressions, like old sneakers or bare feet that had dried mud stuck to them. I got the worst kind of feeling then. Something about how clean and aimless they were. Not someone hiking, not someone camping, someone watching. I told myself it was probably a drifter or a ranch hand messing around. Still, I packed up fast and didn't eat breakfast. I moved even further out, another 4 miles deeper into the scrubland, following a dry riverbed for most of the way. My legs were burning by the time I found a new place to stop. There was a small rise nearby with dead brush and a fallen log I could use to block wind. I set up camp behind it and covered parts of my tent with loose branches for camouflage. That night, I kept the gun unholstered and my pack ready to grab. I didn't want to be there anymore. I told myself if I made it through the night, I'd hike back toward the car at first light. It would take hours, but I was done. I didn't sleep at all. Started just after 10 p.m. First, a single footstep, then another. Too slow to be an animal, too heavy to be wind. Then silence. I laid on my side with my ears straining. The steps came again, this time from a different direction. Someone was circling again. Then I heard something I'll never forget. The sound of breathing. Not close, but clear enough to recognize. A low, rasping inhale, like someone winded but trying to stay quiet. Couldn't move. I just laid there, heart hammering, while whoever was out there crept around the tent for hours. At one point, I thought they were gone. I sat up slowly and tried to look through the tent fabric. Nothing. No sounds. But then, from the far side of the rise, I heard something scrape. A light dragging noise like a branch or a piece of cloth brushing rock. I stayed in the tent until dawn. When it got light, I emerged to find more prints, same size, same vague shape. But this time, there were drag marks next to them. Like whoever it was had something slung over their shoulder that brushed the ground. Or maybe they were limping. I didn't look around too long. I packed in 10 minutes and started walking. The hike back was brutal. I didn't stop to rest. I barely ate. Every sound made me jump. I followed my GPS back to the general area of my car and finally reached the road around 3 p.m. When I saw my vehicle, I almost cried. But even then, I checked underneath and around it before unlocking the doors. I drove straight back to Flagstaff, got a cheap motel, and locked myself inside. The weirdest part came later. I didn't tell anyone about it for weeks. But when I finally looked up stories of strange people in the desert, I found more than a few. Old threads on forums, local articles, posts by campers who'd had similar experiences. Footsteps at night, human-shaped tracks, heavy breathing, watching from a distance. Some people called them skinwalkers, borrowing from old Navajo legends. But none of the stories had magic or monsters. They were just about people, real people who lived out there miles from roads, wearing tattered clothes, watching strangers from a distance. Some people said they were hermits. Others thought they were ex-cons, drug addicts, or survivalists. Some claimed they were just mentally ill and dangerous. Whatever the truth was, I had no interest in figuring it out. I haven't been back to Arizona since. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, and never without cell service. That trip reminded me that out in the wild, the most dangerous things aren't bears or weather or even getting lost. It's the people who choose to stay hidden. I was 36 that summer. I'd been working as a park ranger for about 11 years, most of it in national parks around the Pacific Northwest. That year, 2016, I was assigned to the Olympic National Park in Washington. Not the most glamorous post, but it had its own kind of quiet beauty. Towering evergreens, winding trails, and a strange stillness that hung over the woods like a heavy curtain. The job was usually simple. Check permits, monitor trails, make sure campers weren't starting fires where they shouldn't. Most of it was boring. You don't sign up to be a ranger thinking it's going to be exciting. If anything exciting happens, it's usually bad. People get lost, injured, or worse. It was late August when I got assigned to patrol a stretch of backcountry trails near the Hoh Rainforest. That zone is remote, thick with mossy trees and fog. Not many people go out there, which was part of the problem. There had been some recent reports from hikers, things going missing from campsites, the feeling of being watched, weird rustling in the woods at night. No one got hurt and nothing too serious happened, but enough people mentioned it that the higher-ups wanted someone to spend a few nights out there, just to keep an eye on things. I volunteered. I figured a few quiet nights in the woods wouldn't be so bad. I'd been out there plenty of times and knew the terrain well enough. I packed up what I needed: tent, sleeping bag, bear spray, sidearm, rations, radio, journal. I even brought a small trail cam to set up, thinking maybe I'd catch a cougar or some other animal wandering near the sites. I hiked in alone. It took most of a day to get to where I was supposed to set up camp, an elevated ridge about 5 miles off the main trail, not far from a disused fire lookout tower that hadn't been maintained in years. From there, I could monitor 2 nearby valleys and the main trail junction. It was a good spot, high ground, decent visibility, and far enough off the path that any casual hiker wouldn't come across it. The first day was uneventful. I set up my tent, filtered some water, and walked the area around camp, looking for signs of recent human activity. I saw some boot prints near a dry stream bed, maybe a week old, maybe more, but nothing fresh. A couple of broken branches. No garbage, no wrappers, no food waste. That night, I cooked some dehydrated chili, watched the sunset over the valley, and turned in early. I kept the rainfly off the tent because the air was dry and the stars were out. The woods were alive with the usual sounds: tree frogs, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl. Normal stuff. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. Not from a noise, but from the absence of one. Total silence. Not even wind in the trees. That kind of silence in the wilderness isn't natural. Something always makes noise, even if it's just the trees creaking or distant water. But that night, everything was dead quiet. I stayed still in my sleeping bag, trying to listen. My heartbeat sounded too loud in my ears. I slowly reached over to my belt and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't turn it on. I just held it. A few minutes went by like that, me listening to nothing, gripping the flashlight hard enough to make my hand hurt. Then I heard something. Not loud, but distinct. It sounded like a rock shifting, maybe 20 or 30 feet from the tent. Not close, but not far enough for comfort either. I held my breath and listened harder. Another soft scrape. Then silence again. Animals don't move like that. Not in my experience. They move quick or they move loud. That slow, deliberate pacing, that's human. I stayed inside the tent. I wasn't about to crawl out there and investigate without a good reason. After 10 or 15 minutes of nothing, I eventually fell back asleep, but it was the kind of sleep where you never really stop listening. The next morning, I checked the area. There were footprints, fresh ones. A size 11 or 12 boot, judging by the tread. Not mine. Someone had circled the camp, maybe 30 feet out, never getting too close. I followed the tracks for about half a mile, but they wandered off into rocky ground and disappeared. I radioed it in. Told dispatch I saw signs of human presence, probably just an off-trail hiker or an illegal camper. They logged it and told me to keep watch. No big deal. That second day I felt uneasy. Couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I kept scanning the trees while I walked. Every time I stopped, I thought I heard something behind me, like someone taking one extra step after I stopped. But I never saw anything. I moved my tent that night, not far, maybe 100 yards downslope behind a fallen tree. I didn't like the idea of sleeping in the same exact spot if someone was watching. I also mounted the trail cam pointing toward where the footprints had been. That night was cold. I wrapped up tight and tried to sleep early, but it was useless. I kept imagining footsteps crunching just outside the tent. A few times I thought I heard them again. Faint movement in the brush. But every time I unzipped the tent and looked, nothing. Around 4 a.m., I heard a sound I'll never forget. A metallic clink, faint but sharp, like a buckle hitting a rock, or a tool dropped on stone. I got out with my flashlight and scanned the woods. Nothing. I circled the camp slowly, heart hammering in my chest, trying to convince myself it was an animal. But nothing made sense. When the sun came up, I checked the trail cam. The battery was drained. Brand new lithium batteries, completely dead after one night. I checked the footage anyway. Nothing had recorded. No movement detected. I felt sick. Something was off. Someone was out there. I decided to move camp further down into the valley. My radio could still reach the base station from there, and I'd be closer to a small stream. I hiked 2 miles south and found a good spot near a rock outcrop. That afternoon, I found a campsite. Not one made by the Park Service, an illegal one. Someone had built a crude fire ring and lean-to, tucked beneath some low branches. There were food wrappers, a torn sleeping pad, and what looked like a half-buried tarp. It hadn't been used recently, maybe a few weeks, but it was clear someone had been staying there for a while. I marked it on my map and took photos for documentation. Something about the site made my skin crawl. The way it was hidden, how the trash was buried instead of packed out. I found a dead crow near the fire pit. No obvious injuries, just dead. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the fire low and stayed outside the tent, wrapped in my bag, listening. Around midnight, I heard movement. Again, that slow, deliberate stepping. I picked up my flashlight and swept it toward the sound. Nothing. I waited. Then, a figure. Far off, just outside the beam. I could see the outline of a man, standing still between two trees. Not moving, not speaking, just watching. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I held my flashlight like a weapon and stared. After maybe a minute, the figure turned and walked back into the woods. Not running, just walking. I packed up before dawn. I didn't care about finishing my patrol. I radioed in and said I was returning to base. The hike back took most of the day. I didn't stop. No breaks. Just steady walking until I saw the ranger station roof through the trees. I filed a report. Told them everything. Footprints, noises, the trail cam, the campsite, the man in the woods. They took it seriously. Sent a team out the next day. They found the illegal camp, but nothing else. No signs of recent activity. No footprints. No figure. The trail cam was examined. Nothing wrong with the wiring or battery housing. Just dead. I took a week off after that. Thought about quitting, but I didn't. Still don't know why. Maybe because I wanted to believe it was just some drifter. A homeless guy living in the woods. It happens. But deep down, I don't think that's all it was. I've spent years in the wilderness. I know what animals sound like. I know how people move when they're lost or scared. Whoever was out there wasn't lost. He wasn't scared. He was careful, quiet, and patient. He didn't want help. He didn't want to be seen. He wanted to watch. Sometimes I wonder how long he'd been out there before I noticed. Days? Weeks? I think about that first night. That silent moment when I woke up. I wonder if he was already watching then, just outside the firelight, waiting to see what I'd do. I still work as a ranger, but I don't camp alone anymore. Not out there, not near the hoe. Too many places to hide, too easy to vanish. And whoever he was, I don't think he ever left. It was the summer of 2016 when I decided to take a week off work and go on a solo camping trip out in the Willamette National Forest in Oregon. I was 29 at the time, and I'd been working nonstop at a small marketing firm in Salem for the past 3 years. I'd saved up some PTO and just wanted to get away from everything for a while. I'd done a lot of hiking and camping growing up with my dad, and even though I hadn't gone alone before, I figured I was well prepared. I had a good tent, gear I trusted, and enough food and water to last me 5 or 6 days. My plan was to park at one of the lesser-used trailheads and hike in about 8 or 9 miles, set up camp near a small lake I'd found on a topo map, and just spend some time out there with no cell signal, no noise, and no people. The trailhead was about a 2-hour drive southeast of Eugene. I left early on a Tuesday morning, reached the gravel parking lot by about 10 a.m., and set out with my 55-liter pack, a rolled-up tent strapped to the bottom. The first few miles were quiet, peaceful, just the sound of my boots on the dirt, birds calling through the trees, and the occasional breeze moving through the fir branches above. I saw no one. The deeper I got into the forest, the more I could feel everything else slipping away. That was what I wanted, just the woods and me. By late afternoon, I made it to the lake. It wasn't very big, maybe a couple 100 feet across, nestled in a little dip in the terrain with a few rocky outcrops on the west side. The trees came right up to the shore. The water was glass still, the kind of clear where you could see every little rock and branch below the surface. I found a dry, flat patch of ground about 20 feet from the edge, and I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping pad, and laid out my food bag to get organized. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some dehydrated chili over my camp stove, watched the last bit of sunlight disappear through the treetops, and turned in early. It got cold fast after dark, but I was used to that. I had a decent sleeping bag rated down to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'd layered up before bed. I didn't even need to pee in the middle of the night, which is rare for me. I slept pretty well. Woke up around 7 to a little mist coming off the lake and birds chirping everywhere. I spent that first full day just hiking around the lake, doing some bushwhacking on the far side, and sitting in the sun with my feet in the water. I had a small fishing rod and tried a few casts, but didn't get any bites. Didn't matter. I wasn't there to catch fish. I was there to get away. That night, I thought I heard something moving through the brush around 3 in the morning. I woke up with that weird feeling like something was nearby. My first instinct was bear. I sat up, listened hard, heard twigs snap. Could have been a deer. I had my bear spray next to me, and my food was hung in a dry bag from a tree branch about 30 feet from camp, well away from my tent. I stayed still and waited. After a few minutes, everything went quiet again. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe even a raccoon. I eventually fell back asleep. On the third day, I hiked up to a small ridge east of the lake. I had to climb over a bunch of deadfall and squeeze through some thick brush, but the view from the top was worth it. Just trees in every direction, no signs of people, not even a plane overhead. I remember sitting up there for a while, just eating some trail mix and thinking about how far I was from everything. Felt good, but something changed that night. I woke up again around 3 a.m. This time it wasn't because I heard something. It was just this feeling, like something wasn't right. I listened, nothing. I sat up, opened the tent a little, peeked out. My headlamp was next to my sleeping bag, but I didn't want to turn it on. My eyes were already adjusted to the dark. The moon was about half full, and I could see the lake through the trees, calm and dark. That's when I noticed something. My food bag was gone. I knew exactly where I had hung it. I tied it with paracord to a high branch and hoisted it up out of reach. Now the rope was dangling and the bag was gone. That wasn't normal. Even if a bear got to it, I would have heard something, and there would be noise or damage to the branch. But the rope was cleanly cut, like a knife or blade had gone through it. That set off some alarms. I grabbed my headlamp and lit up the area. Walked around, looked for tracks. I found some boot prints near the base of the tree. Not mine. They were newer. The dirt was still soft from some rain earlier in the week, and these prints were fresh. That's when I started to feel uneasy. Someone had been here, maybe watching, maybe waiting for me to go to sleep. I packed up fast the next morning. I was already low on food, and now it was gone. I had maybe 2 granola bars in my day pack and a couple of trail snacks, but nothing to last another 2 or 3 days. My plan had been to hike out on Friday, but it was Thursday morning, and I didn't want to wait around. I decided to take a different route back, a longer loop that cut across an old fire road I'd seen on the map. It would take me a bit further east before turning south and eventually back west toward the trailhead. I figured maybe I could avoid whoever had taken my food, assuming they were still in the area. The hike was rough, lots of up and down, overgrown trails, and parts of the fire road had been taken over by brush and erosion. I kept moving fast, checking behind me every few minutes, stopping to listen. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be out there, following at a distance. Around 3 p.m., I stopped to rest and eat one of the bars I had left. I was on a high point looking back the way I came. I thought I saw something move through the trees, maybe 100 yards down the slope. Just a flash of motion, too quick to be sure. I stayed still, waited, watched. Nothing came out. I didn't wait long after that. I started moving again, and this time I didn't stop. I didn't make it back to the trailhead before dark. I was still about 4 miles out when the sun dipped behind the trees. I didn't want to risk hiking blind, so I found a flat spot off the trail, set up my tent fast, and got inside. I didn't cook anything. I had nothing to cook. I just drank some water, laid down, and listened. Every little sound made my heart beat faster. At around midnight, I heard something again. Steps. Not heavy like an animal. Soft, careful, human. I held my breath. The steps stopped maybe 15 feet from my tent. Then nothing. Just silence. No breathing, no moving. I laid there, frozen, clutching the handle of the bear spray with one hand and a small knife with the other. Minutes passed. Still nothing. Then the steps started again. They circled the tent. I could hear sticks crack under slow, deliberate steps. Then silence. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Could have been an hour. I didn't sleep at all. By first light, I was moving. I packed up in record time and hit the trail again. The last few miles were a blur. I kept looking behind me, scanning the woods. I didn't eat, just drank a bit of water to keep from crashing. When I finally reached the gravel lot, my car was the only one there. I unlocked it fast, threw my pack in the back, and got in. But here's the part that still sticks with me. As I was pulling out, I saw footprints in the dirt next to my car. Not mine. They came from the trail, stopped near the driver's side, then turned and went back toward the trees. Whoever had taken my food had followed me. They'd watched me. They came to my tent in the night, and they followed me all the way back to my car. I drove straight to the ranger station, told them everything. They sent someone out to check the area, but I never heard anything back. I didn't have a name or a face or any proof, just a gut feeling and some boot prints. I haven't gone solo camping since, not because I'm scared of the woods, but because I'm scared of people who hide in them. I was 33 years old when I decided to take a solo camping trip in northern New Mexico. It was late September 2021, and I had been working remotely for over a year. My job in graphic design was flexible, and the constant screen time was grinding me down. I hadn't had a real break since the start of the pandemic. I wanted to get out, off the grid, away from emails, phones, meetings, just the sound of the wind and the trees. I figured I'd go for 3 or 4 days, hike a little, read some books, sleep under the stars. Nothing fancy, just quiet. I chose a spot up in Carson National Forest, near a lesser-known area between Tres Piedras and Hopewell Lake. It's not exactly a tourist magnet, and that was the appeal. I didn't want people. I brought my older SUV, a beat-up silver 2007 4Runner, packed with supplies. I'd been camping plenty of times, though rarely alone. I knew the basics. I had a water filter, plenty of food, a small propane stove, a first aid kit, GPS, and a satellite communicator. I wasn't reckless. I also brought my 9mm pistol, not because I expected trouble, but because it's just something I always do when going deep into the woods. You never know. I reached the forest around noon on a Tuesday. The sky was completely clear, a dull, sharp blue that reminded me how far I was from the city. It had rained the weekend before, so the dirt roads leading into the woods were hard and cracked, not muddy. I drove about 7 miles off the main highway onto one of the old forest roads, narrow and deeply rutted. It hadn't seen maintenance in years, but I managed to get through, even though the 4Runner suspension protested the whole way. After a while, I found a small clearing surrounded by tall ponderosa pines. There were no signs of recent use, no beer cans, no tire tracks, no burned-out fire pits. It felt undisturbed. Perfect. I set up camp near the tree line, where the forest was thick enough to provide some shelter from the wind. My tent was a 2-person Big Agnes model I'd used plenty of times. I pitched it about 30 yards from where I parked the truck. I like to keep a bit of distance between my sleeping area and where I cooked and stored food, partly for safety and partly for comfort. You never know what animals are around, even in this part of New Mexico. I'd seen black bears before, though never up close. The first day went just the way I hoped. I set everything up, made some tea on the camp stove, and hiked out a short loop trail I'd marked on my GPS. Nothing too far, maybe 3 miles total. The forest was quiet. No birds, no insects, just the wind moving through dry branches. I didn't even see any deer or squirrels. It felt oddly empty, but I liked that. I made a small fire that night and cooked up some dehydrated rice and beans. Tasted fine, not great. I read for a bit under my headlamp and went to sleep around 9:30 p.m. That night was cold, colder than I expected. My sleeping bag was rated for 30 degrees, and I had a liner, but I still woke up shivering around 3 a.m. I could hear the trees creaking as they swayed. It wasn't windy exactly, but the air felt restless, like it was waiting for something to move it harder. I dozed back off eventually. The next morning, I made some instant coffee and sat by the fire pit to warm up. My second day plan was to hike out a bit farther. I had mapped a longer route that led past an old logging road and looped back toward a seasonal creek. I started around 10 a.m., carrying a small day pack with water, snacks, a knife, and my satellite beacon. I wore layers because it warmed up fast once the sun came up. By noon, I was sweating through my shirt. Around 12:30, I came across something strange near the logging road. It was a pile of trash, old food wrappers, 2 crushed beer cans, and a torn-up pair of jeans. They were stiff with dried mud, maybe even blood, but I couldn't tell. I poked around with a stick. Everything looked like it had been there for weeks, maybe months. Still, it felt weird, out of place. It was the only sign of human activity I'd seen since I arrived. I kept going, but something in my gut had changed. The forest didn't feel quiet anymore, it felt watchful. I tried to shake it off. I reminded myself that people camped and partied in the woods all the time, especially young guys who didn't care about packing out their trash. Still, I kept looking over my shoulder as I walked. That tension stayed with me the rest of the hike. I got back to camp around 4:15 p.m., legs sore, but otherwise fine. The temperature was dropping fast, so I started a fire early and made dinner. As I was cleaning up, I heard something about 50 yards off in the trees. It wasn't loud, just the unmistakable crunch of a boot on dry leaves. Not an animal, not wind, person. I froze. I didn't want to yell out, didn't want to alert whoever it was that I'd heard them. Instead, I waited silently by the fire until the sounds stopped. After a minute or two, I walked slowly toward the truck, trying to move naturally, like nothing was wrong. I unlocked it and pulled the pistol out of the glove box, keeping it low, just in case. I didn't think I'd need it. Probably just a hunter passing through, maybe someone scouting for elk. Still, the forest was supposed to be empty. That's why I picked this place. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the pistol in my sleeping bag and listened. Every little twig snap made my heart jump. Nothing happened, though. No more footsteps, no lights, no voices, just silence. The third day, I felt different. Not scared exactly, but on edge. I skipped hiking and stayed around camp. I moved my chair so I could watch the forest in every direction. I read, but only a few pages at a time before checking around me again. The wind had picked up, and the pines whistled and groaned overhead. Around 2 p.m., I walked out about 100 yards behind my tent to check out a rocky outcrop I'd noticed before. When I got there, I saw boot prints in the dirt, deep, recent. Someone had been there, probably this morning. They weren't mine. The tread was different, heavier. I knelt and touched the soil, still moist underneath. Fresh. I turned and scanned the forest. Nothing, just trees and wind. That was it for me. I went back to camp and started packing. Something wasn't right out here. I'd planned to stay one more night, but I didn't want to push my luck. By 4:30, everything was loaded into the truck. I was about to pull out when I saw something that stopped me cold. There were fresh footprints, same tread as before, leading from the trees straight to where my tent had been. I hadn't heard a thing. They'd come while I was at the outcrop, maybe even watching me. That was all the confirmation I needed. I drove out fast, wheels throwing up dust, suspension groaning the whole way. It took nearly an hour to reach the main road. I didn't see a single person the whole drive out. When I hit the highway, I felt my shoulders drop. Relief. I drove straight to a gas station in Chama and parked near the pumps. I sat there for 15 minutes just breathing, letting it all come down. That night, I stayed in a cheap motel. I kept the pistol on the nightstand. I didn't sleep well, kept waking up thinking I heard something outside. In the morning, I walked around the Forerunner to check it over before heading home. That's when I saw it, on the rear bumper, scratched into the dust. For letters. Late. That word sat in my brain like ice. Someone had been close enough to touch my truck. They'd been waiting, watching. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed another night. I don't want to know. I drove straight home and didn't stop except for gas. I didn't report it. What would I say? No crime, no evidence. Just a feeling, some footprints, a word. I told a few friends, and they said maybe it was a prank, or maybe I imagined it. But I know what I saw. I know how it felt. Since then, I haven't camped alone again. Maybe I never will. It's not the animals that worry me. It's not the cold or getting lost. It's people. The ones who move silently, who leave no sign except a footprint in the dirt or a word in the dust. People are the real danger out there. It was August 2018, and I was 28 at the time. I had just gone through a rough breakup and needed to get away from everything. My apartment, my job, the noise of the city. I lived in Toledo, Ohio, and the city heat that summer had been unbearable. I wanted silence, space, and something to take my mind off things. That's how I found myself packing up my old hiking bag and heading out toward an abandoned rock quarry I remembered from years ago. When I was in high school, a few of us used to ride dirt bikes out near this place. It was out past Napoleon, about an hour and a half drive from Toledo, hidden behind overgrown trees and fencing that had rusted and collapsed in some places. The quarry had been shut down since the early 2000s, supposedly due to a couple of serious accidents involving unstable ground and poor safety standards. As far as I knew, no one went out there anymore. I thought that would make it the perfect place to camp. Total solitude, nothing but empty land and the skeletal remains of old machinery and crumbling concrete buildings. That's what I wanted, quiet. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I wasn't trying to be secretive. I just didn't think it mattered. I packed light but smart. Tent, sleeping bag, freeze-dried meals, headlamp, water bottles, a knife, a little collapsible stove, and my old SIG P226 I hadn't used in a while. I wasn't expecting trouble, but it felt stupid not to bring it just in case. I also packed a notebook and a couple of books. I figured I'd get some thinking done. The drive out was uneventful. I left around noon, took back roads once I passed Defiance, and followed a few gravel roads until I found the old dirt path that led up to the quarry. Nature had tried hard to take the road back. Weeds and brush had crept up the middle, and I had to park half a mile away because a fallen tree blocked the last stretch. I hiked the rest of the way with my pack digging into my shoulders, sweat already soaking through my shirt. But when I finally climbed the ridge and looked down into the quarry, I felt a strange sense of peace. The pit opened wide below me, massive and silent. You could still see the old terraced cuts down into the rock, now filled with weeds and small trees. Pools of still water had collected at the bottom, dark and greenish. On the far side stood the remains of the old loading station and a few maintenance buildings, all crumbling but still upright. A rusted conveyor belt hung limp in the sun, stretching from the upper ledge down to the floor like some ancient dead snake. I made my way down the slope carefully, taking a winding path along the old haul road that wrapped around the edge. It took me about 15 minutes to reach the bottom. I picked a spot not far from the largest building, probably an equipment garage back in the day, and set up camp beside a low wall that gave me some shelter from the wind. Once my tent was up, I just sat on a rock and looked around. It was dead quiet, just the occasional sound of insects or the wind catching a loose piece of metal on one of the buildings. There were no trails, no tire tracks, no beer cans or trash. Nothing to show that anyone had been there in years. That's what I liked about it. I thought I'd sleep like a baby, but that night didn't go how I expected. I made some dinner and read for a while. As the sun went down, everything turned gold and then deep blue. The shadows in the quarry got long and sharp, and even though the air was still warm, I felt myself shivering a little. I kept my flashlight close as it got dark and eventually crawled into my tent around 9:30. I lay awake for a while, listening to the distant chirp of crickets and frogs echoing off the rock. But somewhere around midnight, I heard something else. It wasn't loud, just a faint metallic clink, like a chain or pipe being tapped. I sat up fast, heart suddenly pounding. I waited. Nothing. Just silence again. I told myself it was probably an old piece of metal shifting in the wind or something falling. Places like that are full of loose junk. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every hour or so, I'd hear another strange sound. Sometimes scraping, sometimes like a dull thud, always faint and far off. I stayed zipped in my tent, listening, clutching the SIG under my sleeping bag. When dawn finally lit up the sky, I was still awake, bleary-eyed and tense. I stepped out of the tent and looked around. Everything looked the same, but my nerves were shot. I walked over to the nearest building and peered inside. It was just what you'd expect. Cracked concrete, graffiti, broken windows, rusted tools left behind. Nothing looked disturbed. I told myself I'd imagine the whole thing, just spooked by being alone in such a dead place. But I should have left then. I should have packed up and hiked back to the car. I didn't. I told myself I was overreacting. I spent the day exploring instead. The quarry had all kinds of weird spots. Collapsed tunnels, old water tanks, piles of broken stone, rebar poking out of the ground like metal weeds. I walked carefully, not wanting to twist an ankle or fall through something unstable. A few times I heard what sounded like rocks falling somewhere deeper in the pit, but I figured it was just ground shifting. Maybe an animal. Around 6 p.m., I returned to camp and made dinner again. I was exhausted from barely sleeping the night before. As the sun dropped, I felt that same uneasy feeling settle over me. It was like something watching, even though I couldn't see anything. That night was worse. Around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and on gravel. That distinct crunch. At first I froze, not breathing. Then I grabbed the gun and unzipped the tent just enough to look out. It was pitch black. I saw nothing, but the steps kept coming, moving slowly, like someone walking near the buildings, circling almost. I stayed like that for at least 20 minutes, heart pounding so hard I thought it would echo off the quarry walls. Then they stopped. Nothing else. No sound. I stayed awake until the sky began to lighten. When morning came, I got out and searched. There were no footprints, but the ground was hard and dry, not great for tracks. Still, it unsettled me more than anything else. That night, I packed everything. I couldn't sleep out there again. I decided to hike out and sleep in my car. As I started up the Old Hall Road, I kept checking behind me. I felt exposed on the open path. The shadows in the pit felt heavier, like they were clinging to the rocks. I reached the ridge and looked back down one last time. Nothing moved, but just as I turned, I saw something that made my stomach twist. Near the building where I'd camped, just beside the wall I had used for shelter, there were fresh marks in the dirt. Not footprints, drag marks. Long, shallow furrows, like someone had pulled something heavy across the ground. They hadn't been there the day before. I stood frozen, staring at them. The tracks led toward the collapsed side of the building and vanished into the dark. I didn't go down to check. I ran. Back at my car, I threw my gear in the trunk and peeled out of there so fast I nearly slid into a ditch. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station with a lit parking lot and people inside. I sat there for over an hour, hands shaking on the steering wheel. It was daylight now. I could have gone to the police, I guess. But what would I tell them? That I heard some noises and saw some marks in the dirt? That I thought someone was out there, maybe living in the ruins of an abandoned quarry? I drove home and didn't tell anyone for months. I didn't go camping again for over a year. When I finally did, it was in a state park, surrounded by families and ranger patrols and lit bathrooms. But I never forgot that quarry. A year later, in the fall of 2019, I got curious. I started digging online, trying to find out more about the place. Not much came up, but I eventually found an old local news article from 2003. It mentioned 2 workers going missing during the final months before the quarry closed. One was never found. The other was discovered at the bottom of a service shaft, weeks after the site had already shut down. No foul play was confirmed. The official story was that both fell due to unsafe conditions. That might be true, but I know what I heard out there. Someone or something human was still living among those ruins. Maybe a drifter, maybe someone hiding from something, or maybe just someone who never left. I don't know, but whatever the case, I learned something from that trip. Just because a place looks abandoned doesn't mean it's empty. And sometimes, being truly alone isn't the scariest part. It's realizing you're not. I was 32 when I decided to take a solo camping trip through the Cévennes region in southern France. It was late September 2018, and the weather had started to shift into that raw kind of autumn cold you feel in your bones. I had some time off work, and I needed a break from the tight rhythm of city life. Paris had started to wear me down. The crowds, the routine, the endless traffic. I wanted silence. I wanted to be alone somewhere far from the noise, in the heart of real nature. The Cévennes are rugged, not like the Alps, more quiet and subtle, but they hold their own kind of weight. Forested hills, empty trails, old stone houses scattered through the valleys. I'd read about the area in a few travel logs and blogs, and it sounded just right for a week of hiking and camping. Wild camping isn't technically legal there, but as long as you pack up in the morning and don't leave trash, the locals usually don't bother you. I arrived by train to a small town called Florac, then took a bus deeper into the countryside. From there, I hiked north, following a loose route that would take me through the national park. The weather was fine at first, crisp and dry. The sky stayed clear, the way it sometimes does for weeks in the south of France when the seasons are shifting. I packed light, just the basics: a waterproof tent, a thick sleeping bag, a decent rain jacket, 2 changes of clothes, a portable stove, freeze-dried food, and a good knife. I carried everything in a 70-liter pack, heavy but manageable. The first few nights were uneventful. I found quiet spots off the trail, far from roads or towns. I slept under tall pines, sometimes near streams. Once I camped in an open field beside an old stone ruin, maybe a barn or sheep shelter from 100 years ago. It was peaceful. I felt alive again, the kind of alive that only comes from solitude, when all you hear is wind and birds and your own breath. By the 5th day, the weather had started to change. I could feel it in the way the wind shifted and the light flattened in the afternoons. The smell of the air grew heavier, like wet leaves and stone. I checked my phone. I only had signal in some higher spots and saw a warning for rain coming in that evening, maybe lasting through the next day. I didn't think much of it. I camped in the rain before. My tent was solid and I knew how to stay dry. I just had to find a good spot to wait it out. Around noon, I passed an old dirt road that branched off into the woods. It looked barely used, 2 tire ruts swallowed by grass and weeds. I figured it might lead somewhere sheltered, so I followed it. After about 30 minutes of walking, I came across a small clearing, maybe 20 meters across. The trees around it were dense, thick oaks and chestnuts, their leaves already starting to turn and fall. It looked like someone had used the spot before. There was a fire ring made of stones, though the ashes were cold and old. Probably another hiker weeks or months ago. I set up my tent on the driest part of the clearing, under a thick chestnut tree. I made sure it was on high ground, in case the rain turned heavy. Then I boiled some water, made coffee, and ate a pack of noodles. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a solid gray, and wind picked up. I gathered some wood under a tarp I carried and got a small fire going, just enough to keep warm before the rain started. Around 6 p.m., the first drops fell. At first it was light, a kind of soft tapping on the leaves. Then it built into a steady drumming, the kind that fills the forest and drowns out everything else. I sat in my tent, zipped up tight, listening to the rain roll across the trees. It was relaxing in a way. I read for a while with my flashlight, then lay back and let the sound carry me into sleep. I don't know exactly what time I woke up. It was still dark, and the rain hadn't stopped. If anything, it had grown stronger. The wind was shaking the tent a little, and I could hear branches creaking. What woke me wasn't the weather, though. It was something else. A sound faint but wrong. Took me a second to register it. A kind of dull metal clink, like something tapping against steel. I froze and listened. Nothing, just the wind and rain. Then I heard it again. A sharp, quick clink. Metal on metal. Not far, maybe 10 or 15 meters from the tent. My first thought was an animal. A deer maybe, or a wild boar rooting around. But boars don't make metallic noises, and deer don't carry tools. I sat up slowly and unzipped the flap just enough to peer out. It was pitch black. I couldn't see anything past a few meters. The rain was coming down so hard it looked like mist in the beam of my flashlight. I turned it off again. I didn't want to be a beacon in the dark. I stayed still for a long time, just listening. Maybe it had been nothing. A tree branch falling on a rock. Something natural. Then I heard it again. This time it was clearer. A scrape, then a clink, like someone dragging something across metal. But there was nothing metal in the clearing. No fences, no cars, nothing. My pulse kicked up hard. I wasn't scared yet, not fully, but my brain was definitely starting to run through scenarios. Maybe a hunter, lost in the woods? But who hikes out this deep in a storm at night? And who doesn't call out? I reached for my knife. It wasn't a big one, just a 6-inch blade I used for food and basic tasks. But it was sharp. I held it tight and stayed low. Minutes passed. No more sounds, just the endless drumming of rain. Then I heard footsteps, not loud, but distinct. Wet footsteps in leaves. Close. I held my breath. My heart was hammering now, louder than the rain. I could hear the steps circling the clearing, slow and deliberate. Not charging, not running, just walking, pausing every few meters. Whoever it was, they weren't lost. They weren't calling for help. They were moving like they knew exactly where they were. And they were alone. That's when the fear really hit me, hard and cold. I camped alone for years. I dealt with bad weather, wild animals, even near hypothermia once. But this was different. This wasn't nature. This was another person. In the middle of the woods, in the middle of the night, in a storm, saying nothing. And they knew I was here. I knew they knew. You can feel that kind of presence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited. The footsteps stopped, maybe 5 meters from my tent. Then nothing. No sound. No movement. Just rain and wind. 5 minutes. 10. 20. Nothing. Eventually I started to shake. Not from cold, but from adrenaline. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever was going to happen. So I made a decision. I packed silently. I rolled up my sleeping bag, stuffed everything I could into my pack, left the tent. I'd come back for it in the morning, if there was a morning. I unzipped the flap and stepped into the rain. I didn't turn on my light. I didn't want to see. I didn't want them to see me. I just moved, fast and quiet, back toward the road I'd followed in. The forest was a blur of shadows and wet branches. The ground was slick and soft. My boots sank into mud. My jacket clung to me like wet plastic. I didn't care. I just moved. I walked for an hour, maybe more. I didn't stop. Not until I found a rise in the ground with a thick cluster of trees. I wedged myself between 2 trunks, half hidden, and sat there until light started to bleed through the clouds. It was a gray, pale morning, still raining. My clothes were soaked through. My fingers were numb, but I was alive. When I finally got the courage to go back, my tent was still there. But something was wrong. The rain had flattened the grass, but I could see footprints, deep ones, all around the tent, dozens of them. Whoever it was had walked around my camp again and again in circles. They'd moved stones, poked at the fire pit, opened my food bag. The tent flap had been unzipped, not torn, carefully opened. They'd been inside. I found muddy prints on the floor of the tent. No gear was missing, not even my stove. But someone had gone through everything, touched it, moved it, studied it. That was it for me. I packed everything, fast. Didn't even bother folding the tent. I just shoved it in wet. Then I hit the trail back toward the town. Didn't stop until I reached a road where I could hitch a ride. The man who picked me up was an old farmer. He didn't speak much English, and I didn't try to explain. I just thanked him and stared out the window. I never reported it. What would I say? That someone walked around my camp? That someone touched my things? That they stood outside in a storm, silent? There's no crime in that. But I've never been so scared in my life. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. Whoever it was, they could have done anything. They had the chance, and they chose not to. That's the part that gets me. The choice, the silence, the presence in the dark. Someone out there watching me walking in circles in the rain. I haven't camped alone since. It was a cold fall evening when I decided to take my dog, Scout, out for a camping trip. I was in my late 20s, and life had been throwing a lot of curveballs my way lately. I needed to clear my head, get out into the wilderness, and remind myself of what truly mattered. My dog was the only companion I needed. He was always there for me, and we had a bond that ran deeper than words could describe. We headed out to a place called Pine Hollow. It was an isolated spot about 2 hours from town. Not many people went there, and that's exactly why I chose it. The fewer people, the better. The campground was tucked away in the forest, where the trees were so thick you couldn't see much beyond the dirt path. I liked it that way, no distractions, no noise, just peace. As we drove up the winding road, the sun was just dipping below the horizon. The orange and pink hues were reflected in the rearview mirror as I took a deep breath, letting the fresh, crisp air fill my lungs. Scout, my border collie, sat next to me, his fur soft and warm against the chill creeping into the truck. He was my best friend, a constant source of comfort. He looked at me with those big, expressive eyes, wagging his tail as if he knew exactly what I needed. I parked the truck by a small clearing near a stream, the sound of the water rushing over rocks soothing to my ears. The campsite was simple, just a few bare essentials. A small fire pit, a couple of benches, and a rustic wooden shelter that looked like it had seen better days. I didn't mind. It was perfect for a solo trip. Scout jumped out of the truck before I even had the chance to fully park, darting toward the trees with his usual excitement. I grabbed the camping gear, including a tent, a sleeping bag, and some food, and followed him into the woods. We set up camp as the evening sky turned dark. I could hear the wind rustling the leaves high above, the occasional crack of a branch or the distant hoot of an owl breaking the silence. Scout didn't seem bothered by the dark, but I could feel something in the air, a tension that seemed to hang like a thick fog. The feeling crept up my spine, but I brushed it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, and it had been a long time since I'd had a moment to just relax. The campfire crackled and popped as I cooked some stew over it. Scout sat by my side, his nose twitching at the scent of the food. We shared a meal in companionable silence, the only sounds being the fire and the wind. Once we were done, I sat back, propping my feet up on a fallen log. Scout lay by the fire, his head resting on his paws, watching the flames dance. The forest around us seemed to grow quieter as the night deepened, and I felt the chill of the air begin to bite into my skin. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and tossed another log onto the fire. That's when I noticed it. Something wasn't right. At first, it was subtle. The forest seemed too still, too silent. Scout's ears were perked up, and he was staring intently into the woods, his body slightly tense. It wasn't like him to act this way. He was usually calm and collected. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the usual noises of the forest. But then there was a rustling sound, soft at first, but growing louder, coming from the direction of the trees. Scout's head whipped toward the sound, and I felt my heart skip a beat. The rustling was followed by a low, guttural sound, like something or someone was moving through the underbrush. "Scout, come here," I whispered, my voice shaky. He didn't move. His focus remained locked on whatever was out there. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck as I stood up, scanning the darkened woods. The shadows between the trees seemed to stretch and twist, and the more I stared, the more distorted they became. I couldn't see anything clearly, but I could feel something watching us. Something wasn't right. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack and flicked it on, pointing it toward the trees. The beam of light cut through the dark, illuminating the underbrush and the trunks of the trees, but there was nothing there, nothing except for the rustling that had now stopped. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I called Scout again, louder this time. "Come on, buddy, let's go." He reluctantly stood up and trotted over to me, but he was still tense, his tail low and his body coiled like a spring. I could feel his unease, and it made my stomach tighten with unease of my own. I decided it was best to call it a night. I grabbed the leash, attached it to Scout's collar, and led him into the tent. We both crawled inside, and I zipped the flap shut, sealing us away from whatever was out there. Scout curled up at my feet, but I could tell he wasn't fully settled. His ears twitched at every noise outside, and he let out the occasional low growl. The night passed slowly. I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind howled through the trees, and branches creaked against each other. But there was something else, too. Every now and then, I heard something moving outside the tent, like something was circling our campsite, just out of view. It was subtle, just a faint rustling in the leaves, a snap of a twig, but it was enough to keep me on edge. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Whatever it was there, and it wasn't leaving. As the hours dragged on, I finally drifted into a restless sleep. But just before dawn, I woke to a noise that made my blood run cold. A loud, unmistakable thud from outside the tent. Scout was on his feet in an instant, barking frantically, his claws scraping against the tent fabric. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I unzipped the tent and shone the light into the forest. Nothing. The beam of light revealed nothing but trees and shadows, but Scout's barking had stopped. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes wide with fear, his body rigid. Then I saw it, movement in the trees. Not an animal, but something far too tall, far too unnatural to be a person. It was standing perfectly still, just beyond the reach of the flashlight, blending into the darkness. The shape was tall, unnaturally thin, with long, spindly arms that reached out toward the trees. I froze, unable to move, unable to look away. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought I might be imagining things. But then the figure shifted, and I could hear the faintest sound of breathing, deep, slow, almost like it was savoring the fear in the air. Scout let out a low growl, his body quivering. I had never seen him act this way, not even when we had encountered other animals in the wild. This was different. The air felt thick with tension, and I realized that whatever was out there, it wasn't just some animal. It was something else entirely. The figure took a step forward, and I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot. My heart raced, and I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed Scout's leash and yanked him back into the tent with me, zipping it shut. I held my breath, praying that whatever it was wouldn't notice us. For the rest of the night, I stayed awake, eyes glued to the entrance of the tent. The sounds outside gradually faded, but I could still feel its presence, lurking just beyond the trees. When morning finally came, I wasted no time packing up my gear. I didn't care about the campfire or the site. I just wanted to get out of there. As I drove away, Scout lying beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me all night long. I looked into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching us. But there was nothing, just trees. But that sense of being hunted, of something being right on the edge of the light, stayed with me. That was the last time I went to Pine Hollow. Some places, some nights are better left alone. I had always been a bit of a skeptic when it came to things that went bump in the night. You know, the usual campfire tales that people told to spook each other and make the woods feel eerie. But I never thought much of them until that night. It was the summer of 2009, and I was 22 years old, just trying to get away for the weekend and have a bit of fun. My dad, a grizzled man in his early 50s with a deep, throaty laugh and a permanent tan from years of working outdoors, had invited me along on a camping trip with a few of his friends. His friends weren't just random people. They were old colleagues from his job in construction, the kind of guys who worked hard, played harder, and always told stories of the wild times they'd had together. It had been a long time since I'd spent time with my dad and his friends. He'd always been the kind of man who loved a good camping trip, and I figured it'd be a nice opportunity to reconnect. The plan was simple: drive out to a remote patch of woods near the Cascade Mountains in Washington State, set up camp, and just get away from the hustle of daily life. The location wasn't far from any cities or towns, tucked away in a patch of trees so dense you couldn't see much beyond the trees. Perfect, right? Peaceful, isolated, no distractions. When we pulled into the forest, the gravel road beneath the tires crunching beneath the weight of our old Ford pickup, I could already feel the weight of the quiet settling in. It was a Saturday afternoon, about 2 p.m., and the sun was high, casting long shadows between the towering pines. My dad, John, was driving. His friend Mike was in the passenger seat, a broad-shouldered guy with a thick beard and permanent squint from squinting in the sun too much. In the back seat was Dawn, another of Dad's buddies, a little older, balding, and grumpy. I didn't know him too well, but I had heard plenty of stories about him over the years. Apparently, he'd been to all kinds of places and had all kinds of stories to tell. We pulled into the clearing where we planned to set up camp. The air smelled of pine, earth, and something fresh, just the scent of the forest. It was a good spot. The trees were thick enough to give us privacy, and there was a little stream running nearby, its sound soothing as it trickled over rocks. We got to work quickly, setting up camp. Don and Mike were in charge of setting up the tents, while my dad worked on the fire pit. I was tasked with unpacking the cooler and getting everything ready for our first night in the woods. Everything felt so normal, so routine. You could have almost forgotten you were miles away from the nearest road. As the evening drew near, we had a fire going. The heat from the flames mixed with the coolness of the evening air. Mike cracked open a beer, and Don rolled a cigarette. The firelight danced across their faces, casting long shadows behind them. I was sitting on a log, leaning back against a tree, staring into the flames. The sky was beginning to darken, and the stars were just starting to peek out from behind the fading light. I remember hearing the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of crickets, and the soft gurgle of the stream. The conversation had turned to old stories, things that had happened back when the guys worked construction together. Mike started telling a story about a time he'd been working late on a site and had heard someone walking around, but when he went outside, there was nobody there. Just the wind, he'd said. Or maybe a bear, but who knows? It was the kind of story you'd expect around a campfire. Nothing too unsettling. But then, Don spoke up. His voice was quieter than usual. He looked over at the tree line as if something had caught his attention. "You ever feel like you're being watched?" he asked, his voice gruff, almost like he was trying to sound tough. Mike chuckled. "What, you're telling me you think something's out here? It's just trees, man." Don didn't laugh. He just shook his head. "I don't know. I've been out here before, and sometimes I swear I feel something moving around in the woods. But when I look, there's nothing there." The conversation shifted, but something in Don's tone stayed with me. The fire crackled, and I tried to shake off the unease that settled in my gut. I didn't want to believe in any of that stuff. I'd grown up hearing these guys talk about all kinds of nonsense, and it was always just a way to mess with you. But as the night wore on and the fire burned lower, I started to feel it. A sense of being watched, just like Don had described. Around 9 p.m., we were sitting around the fire, the night fully settled in. The shadows of the trees stretched far and wide, the world reduced to nothing but firelight and darkness. That was when we heard it. It started as a faint rustling in the trees, just a soft sound, like leaves brushing against each other. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it stopped. And then, a few seconds later, it started again, closer this time. My dad, John, stood up, his hand moving instinctively to the pocket where he kept his knife. Mike froze, staring toward the noise. Don wasn't looking at the trees. He was staring at the fire, his face hardening. The rustling came again, this time followed by a soft, dragging sound, a kind of scraping sound like something heavy being dragged across the ground. It was unmistakable. My heart started to pound in my chest. "Probably just an animal," Mike said, though his voice didn't sound as confident as before. He looked toward the tree line, squinting. "No," Don said, "that's not an animal. I've heard that sound before." "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Don replied. His voice had gone tight, almost strained. "But whatever it is, it's not right." The scraping sound came again. It was closer now, and this time there was no mistaking it. It was something deliberate, something large, moving through the brush with intent. "I'm going to take a look," John said, his voice low. He didn't wait for anyone to stop him. With a quick movement, he grabbed a flashlight and walked toward the trees, his boots crunching on the dry ground. I wanted to go with him. I wanted to know what was going on. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt thicker, almost oppressive, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. We waited in silence. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of branches. My mind raced with possibilities. None of them good. Mike was standing up now, his hand on the edge of the axe that was leaning against the tree beside him. Don was still staring into the fire, his eyes narrowed. A few minutes passed, and then we heard it. John's voice, distant but clear, calling out to us. "Guys, get over here. Now." We rushed to our feet, hearts pounding. We didn't hesitate. We didn't ask questions. We just moved. John was standing at the edge of the clearing, his flashlight pointing towards something in the shadows. At first, I couldn't see what it was, but as I stepped closer, my stomach dropped. There, partially hidden behind the trees, was a man. He was crouched low, his body twisted unnaturally. He didn't look right. His clothes were ragged, his skin pale, and his eyes were wild, bloodshot, and staring straight at us. He didn't move. We stood there, frozen, couldn't breathe. My mind was telling me to run, but my body wouldn't move. The man didn't blink, didn't make a sound. It was like he wasn't even human. And then he stood up. Slowly, he took one step forward, and that was enough to break the spell. Mike reacted first, grabbing his axe and swinging it in the air. Don pulled me back, urging me to move. "We need to go," he said, his voice sharp. I didn't argue. We backed away slowly, eyes still fixed on the figure in the trees. I don't know how long we stayed like that, but it felt like an eternity. When we finally turned and ran, I didn't look back. We didn't stop until we were back in the clearing, where the fire burned brightly. But the man didn't follow. He just stood there in the dark, watching. We didn't sleep much that night. Every rustle in the trees, every snap of a twig, made us jump. We stayed close to the fire, our eyes constantly scanning the darkness. But the man never came back. Eventually, dawn broke, and with it, the heavy tension lifted slightly. The air was still thick with unease, but nothing happened after that. By the time we packed up and left the next morning, I didn't want to look back. That place, the trees, the sounds, the feeling of being watched, it had all become a nightmare. It's been years since that night. I've tried to tell myself it was just a man who got lost or maybe someone who lived in the woods, but deep down I know what I saw. And every time I go camping now, I can't shake the feeling that something's out there, something that's watching from the trees, and I'll never forget the look in those eyes. The rain came in torrents, beating against the roof of my tent like 1,000 tiny fists. I was alone in the woods, miles from civilization, tucked away in a small corner of the national park. The only sounds were the relentless downpour and the occasional rustle of the trees bending in the wind. This wasn't supposed to be the way I spent my weekend. I had planned a quiet camping trip to clear my head, maybe do some hiking, and enjoy a bit of solitude. But now it felt like I was trapped in the middle of nowhere, with no way out. I had been working for Greg for 3 years, and the man knew how to make a job feel like a test of endurance. He was demanding, always pushing us to get things done faster, better, smarter. It had taken its toll on me, so I decided to get away for the weekend. I grabbed my gear and drove out to this secluded camping spot. I didn't tell Greg, and he wouldn't have cared anyway. I wanted nothing more than to be alone for a few days, free from his constant, overbearing presence. But now, as I sat in the tent, hearing the rain beat against the fabric, I wasn't so sure. It was the kind of rain that soaked you to the bone, and the wind only made it worse. I hadn't planned for this kind of weather. The forecast had said a little rain, but not this. This was something different, something unnerving. The fire I had tried to start was nothing but a pile of damp wood, the smoke barely making it past the tent. I thought about calling it quits and heading back to the car, but the road back was long, winding, and slippery from the storm. Besides, there was no way I was driving in this mess. I figured I might as well try to ride it out. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a branch snapping, something moving in the trees, but then I heard it again. A sound that didn't belong. It was a slow, deliberate crunching noise, like someone walking carefully, deliberately through the underbrush, trying not to make noise but failing. My heart rate kicked up a notch. The sound was faint, but I could tell it was close, way too close. I had read about animals in the woods, deer, maybe a bear, but this wasn't the typical animal sound. This was something heavier, more human. I crawled to the edge of the tent, careful not to make a sound, and peered through a tiny gap in the fabric. All I could see were the thick, dripping trees, their branches sagging under the weight of the rain. Nothing moved. Maybe I was just paranoid. I had been alone for hours, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. The sound stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but the rain. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. It wasn't uncommon to feel jumpy when you were out here alone, especially in weather like this. The mind tends to create noises where there are none. I lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind raced. It wasn't just the sound I'd heard. It was the feeling, the gut instinct that something was wrong. I kept thinking of Greg, of how he always made me feel like I was on edge. Even out here, in the middle of nowhere, it felt like he was still hovering over me. I decided to take a walk. Maybe some fresh air would clear my mind, help me forget about the odd sound. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, braving the heavy downpour. The ground was slick, and I slipped more than once as I made my way toward the small clearing where I had originally planned to set up camp. The rain hit me like needles, and the wind cut through my jacket. The forest seemed alive in a way it hadn't before. The trees swayed violently, and every shadow seemed to shift as if something was moving in the darkness. I told myself it was just the wind, that the storm had unsettled my senses, but the crunching sound from earlier echoed in my mind. I took a deep breath and shook it off. It was just the woods, just the rain playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. This time, much closer. My stomach dropped. I stopped, heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The rain pounded on, the wind howled, but the sound of the footsteps continued. Slow, deliberate. They were almost in sync with my own movements. I didn't dare turn around. I didn't want to see what was behind me, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a primal warning I couldn't ignore. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, and my pulse quickened. I started walking faster, hoping I could outrun whatever was behind me. The flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath. The beam of light danced erratically, casting long, twisted shadows across the trees. The footsteps picked up pace, mirroring mine. Whoever or whatever was out there was following me, and I had no idea why. I reached the clearing, and I saw my tent in the distance. I knew I had to get back to it, but my legs felt like lead. The footsteps were still there, never faltering, always just behind me. I could almost hear the rhythm of the person's breathing, matching mine, getting closer. I broke into a run, my feet slipping on the wet ground. The trees blurred past me as I pushed myself harder, faster. When I finally reached the tent, I dove inside and zipped it shut, my hands trembling. I pressed my back against the fabric, gasping for breath, every muscle in my body taut with fear. I strained my ears, listening for the footsteps, the sound of someone or something approaching, but there was nothing. The forest was eerily silent now, the rain still pouring down, the wind still howling, but no footsteps. I sat there for what felt like hours, just listening, my breath shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. I checked the tent zippers, made sure everything was secure. The adrenaline was wearing off, and I could feel my body shaking from the mix of cold and fear. I had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. But there was no more sound, no more footsteps. After a long while, I finally let myself relax, realizing that whatever had been following me was gone. The storm still raged outside, but the fear began to fade, replaced by a nagging curiosity. Who had been out there? What had they wanted? I thought about going back out, checking the area, but something told me not to. I had had enough for one night. I stayed in the tent, curled up in my sleeping bag, and tried to get some rest. Morning came and the rain had finally stopped. The air was thick and damp, and the forest was silent, almost serene. I packed up my gear slowly, still uneasy, still unsure of what had happened the night before. As I walked back to my car, I glanced over my shoulder one last time, and that's when I saw it. A single set of footprints in the mud, leading up to the spot where my tent had been. But they didn't stop there. They continued, moving past my camp, deeper into the woods, as if whoever had followed me had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to make their move. I never went camping there again, and I never told Greg what happened. He wouldn't have cared. But I knew I would never forget the sound of those footsteps, the feeling of being watched, the unshakable sense that something had been out there with me, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Maybe I'll go camping again someday, but I'll make sure it's somewhere where I'm not alone, somewhere where I can't feel the eyes of the woods watching me in the rain. I had always been drawn to the solitude of the woods. There was something calming about the stillness, the quiet hum of nature that filled the space when you were alone in a remote place. That's why I decided to go camping in the middle of nowhere, far from the bustling world I was used to. It was late October, and the air had that crisp chill that reminded me of when I was younger, back when I would take solo trips into the woods to clear my head. This time, however, was different. I wasn't just going for peace of mind. I needed to escape from everything else. I set up camp at a remote site I had heard about from a friend, an old, forgotten stretch of land, tucked away in a dense forest, the kind of place that felt as if no one had been there in years. No one except for the occasional hunter or hiker who might stumble across it by accident. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was going, thinking I'd be safe. Who would think to look for me here? As I unpacked my gear, the evening sunlight started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The weather was still mild, but there was a storm rolling in from the west. I could feel the pressure change in the air, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It wasn't the first time I'd camped in this kind of weather, so I wasn't concerned, but something felt off. It wasn't the storm or the cold that unsettled me. It was the strange stillness that had settled over the forest. There wasn't a single animal noise. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the distant call of a coyote. It was like the entire forest had fallen into an eerie silence. By the time the storm arrived, I was already sitting in front of my campfire, the flames flickering in the cool air. The rain had started to fall in sheets, pattering against the leaves overhead and causing the smoke to swirl. I made sure my tent was properly secured. The rain fly taught to prevent any leaks. The fire crackled, offering warmth and light, but the atmosphere around me felt different, thicker somehow. I took a sip from my thermos, feeling the warm liquid burn down my throat, when I heard it, a snap of a twig, soft but distinct. I froze, eyes darting to the edge of the tree line. For a moment, I thought it was just a trick of the wind or an animal, but something inside me knew that wasn't it. Felt like someone was out there watching. I stood up slowly, trying to peer through the rain and trees. Nothing, just the shifting shadows of the storm. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I hadn't slept much the night before, and the isolation was starting to get to me. But that didn't explain the strange sensation that crawled up my spine. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, moving through the woods. I walked around the camp, checking everything twice to make sure it was secure. The wind picked up, causing the trees to sway. Then, another snap, closer this time. My heart started to pound. That wasn't an animal. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area, sweeping the beam across the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw something in the distance. A figure, standing just beyond the edge of the forest. My breath caught. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with its outline blending into the shadows. I flicked the flashlight off, then back on, trying to adjust the beam. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. I stood frozen, my heart thudding in my chest. The air felt suddenly heavy, oppressive, as if something was waiting. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe the storm was playing with my mind. I turned back to the campfire, trying to regain some sense of normalcy, but the unease lingered. The night dragged on, and the storm continued to rage, the wind howling through the trees. I kept my fire going, adding wood when it started to die down. I thought about going to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rain pounded on the tent, and every now and then I'd hear something in the woods. Branches snapping, footsteps in the distance. The sound was always just far enough to keep me on edge, like whoever or whatever was out there knew just how to make me nervous without getting too close. Around midnight, the rain finally let up, leaving the forest drenched but quieter. I decided to make my way to the stream nearby to refill my water bottles. The path was muddy, and the forest was still thick with mist, making it hard to see. As I walked, the only sound was the squelch of my boots in the soft earth. Then I saw something. At first, I thought it was a trick of the mist, a shadow shifting between the trees. But as I got closer, I realized it was a figure standing just off the path. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, with his back to me. He wore a heavy jacket, a hood pulled low over his face, hiding his features. His stance was rigid, unnaturally still, and the moment I saw him, my heart skipped a beat. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was he lost? Maybe he had been out in the storm, trying to find shelter? But something about him didn't seem right. It wasn't just the fact that he was out here in the middle of nowhere. There was a sense of wrongness to him, a feeling deep in my gut that told me I shouldn't approach. "Hey!" I called out, my voice more hesitant than I intended. "Are you okay?" No response. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me at all. I stepped closer, trying to get a better look at his face, but it was hidden beneath the hood. As I took another step, the man suddenly turned, his head jerking in my direction with unnatural speed. His eyes were wide and black. No pupils, just a void of darkness. I felt my stomach churn as a sense of dread flooded over me. Before I could react, he started walking away from me, moving with an unsettling speed. I could hear his footsteps crunching in the leaves, but when I looked down the path, he was already gone, swallowed by the trees. I stood there, breathless, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The forest was still, save for the faint sound of the stream in the distance. The man, or whatever he was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned quickly and headed back to camp, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got back, I quickly secured the tent and started a new fire, trying to calm myself down. I kept telling myself it was just a person who had lost his way, maybe another hiker or camper who had been caught in the storm. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. I lay in my tent that night, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. Every little sound, the rustling of the trees, the occasional crack of a branch, made my pulse race. I tried to tell myself that everything was fine, that I was just being paranoid. But the more I thought about the man, the more I realized something wasn't right. There was something inhuman about him, something off. As I lay there in the dark, I heard it again. The snap of a twig, then the sound of something moving through the forest. Slow, deliberate steps coming closer. This time, I didn't even bother getting up. I knew what was out there now, and I wasn't about to face it. The sound of the footsteps came nearer, then stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything that might tell me what was out there. And then, there was a low growl, the kind of noise that sends a shiver down your spine. Not an animal growl, but something more human. I couldn't take it anymore. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my backpack and started packing in the dark, the noise outside growing louder. Something was coming closer, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. I packed up as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. As I pulled the last of my gear together, I heard something crash through the underbrush. It was loud, frantic. The growl came again, closer this time, almost at my tent. I zipped the door shut, grabbed my flashlight, and bolted out into the rain, not looking back. I ran down the path toward the truck as fast as my legs would carry me. The sound of footsteps followed me, but I didn't dare look back. I could feel whatever it was closing in, gaining on me. My breath was ragged, my legs burning from the effort, but I pushed myself harder. When I finally reached the truck, I fumbled for my keys, panic rising in my chest. I got the door open and slammed it shut behind me, the engine roaring to life as I sped away. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, my heart still hammering in my chest. I had no idea what that thing was, or if it was still following me. But I knew one thing for sure: whatever it was, it wasn't human. The sun was setting behind the mountains as I trudged through the thick underbrush of the woods. I had been hunting solo for a few days now, deep in the wilderness of northern Maine. My name is Jack, and I've been hunting since I was a kid. This was supposed to be a peaceful trip, a chance to get away from the noise of the world and reconnect with nature. Little did I know, this would turn into something far darker. I set up camp at the edge of a small clearing. The wind was picking up, rustling the leaves above me. The weather had been unpredictable, with clouds rolling in fast from the west. I could smell rain in the air. It had been a long day of hunting, and I hadn't seen a single deer. I wasn't disappointed. Hunting wasn't always about the kill for me. Sometimes just being out there in the woods was enough. But tonight, I'd hoped for more. The solitude made me restless. I had my tent set up just off the trail, the fire crackling nearby. I had a few cans of beans and some jerky for dinner. Simple but effective. As I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The woods were alive with sounds, but there was something else, something off, a feeling I couldn't place. The distant howls of coyotes pierced the silence, but that wasn't it. It was more primal, a kind of presence in the trees. After finishing my meal, I sat by the fire, the warmth pushing back against the growing chill. The sun had dipped behind the mountains, leaving the sky a deep purple. I pulled my coat tighter and reached for my rifle, just out of habit. My dad always told me that if you're in the woods alone, you should never be without your weapon. Night had fully settled in by then, the fire flickering in the darkness. It was when I heard the crunching of leaves behind me that the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I froze, the weight of the rifle heavy in my hands. I listened. The sound was soft at first, just a few twigs snapping, then a deeper crunch of boots on the forest floor. Someone was out there. I turned slowly, scanning the dark tree-line. There was nothing, just shadows. My heart raced as I tried to calm myself. Could have been an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that it wasn't. The woods weren't exactly full of hikers, especially not this deep into the backcountry. I hadn't seen a soul since I arrived. I decided to grab my flashlight. I didn't like the idea of being out here with something or someone lurking nearby. I took a few cautious steps toward the edge of the clearing. The beam of the flashlight swept over the underbrush, the light bouncing off the leaves and rocks. Nothing. I stood there for a few minutes, listening to the night. The wind had picked up, making it harder to hear anything approaching. My nerves were on edge, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me. I went back to the fire, adding another log to keep it from dying down. The flames flickered and crackled, sending sparks into the night. I sat down again, staring into the flames, trying to push away the unsettling feeling. But then I heard it again. A faint rustling, this time closer. My heart rate spiked as I slowly stood up. I gripped my rifle tightly, feeling the weight of it in my hands. There was definitely something moving out there. I shone the flashlight into the trees again, but the beam only illuminated the darkness, revealing nothing. But then I saw something, or rather, I thought I did. A flash of movement, just at the edge of the light. It was quick, almost too quick to be sure of, but it was there. I wasn't alone. My mind raced. It had to be a person. But why would anyone be out here at this hour? I had planned my trip carefully, ensuring I was well off the beaten path, away from others. The thought of someone wandering the woods at night didn't sit right with me. I grabbed my pack and slung it over my shoulder, keeping the rifle in front of me. I wasn't going to wait around to find out who or what was out there. I needed to move. The ground was soft beneath my boots as I made my way back toward the trail. The woods felt eerily quiet now. The only sounds the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of twigs. The fire behind me flickered and cast long shadows across the clearing, but I didn't dare turn back. I walked for what felt like hours, my eyes scanning the trees, looking for any sign of movement. The flashlight in my hand seemed weak against the vast darkness around me. The deeper I went into the woods, the more isolated I felt. The only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional rustle of the trees. I finally stopped when I reached a small creek, the water trickling over rocks. I leaned against a tree, trying to catch my breath. The feeling of being watched had not gone away. It had only grown stronger. That's when I heard the noise again, a faint rustle in the brush. It was too deliberate this time, too controlled. I raised the flashlight, pointing it in the direction of the sound. And there, just beyond the reach of the light, I saw it. A figure. It was too far to make out clearly, but it was tall, hunched over. At first, I thought it was a man, but something about the posture seemed off, unnatural. It wasn't just standing, it was like it was crouching, watching. I froze. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. I had no doubt it was a person, but why was he out here at this hour? In the middle of nowhere? My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly raised my rifle. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, hidden in the shadows. The beam of my flashlight flickered as I kept it trained on the spot where I had seen the figure. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. I didn't dare move. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone. It melted back into the trees, vanishing without a sound. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stood there, trying to steady myself. What the hell had I just seen? I wasn't going to find out. I turned on my heel and started walking again, faster this time. I kept my rifle ready, the flashlight scanning the trees. The feeling of being watched was overpowering now. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the brush made me jump. I couldn't shake the thought that something or someone was following me. I don't know how long I walked, but it felt like hours. The forest seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing against my skin. I kept my pace quick, my mind racing with fear and adrenaline. Eventually, I reached the edge of a small hill, the ground sloping downward toward a narrow path. I knew this area. I had camped here before. It was familiar, but tonight it felt different. Something wasn't right. I crouched low to the ground, listening. There was no movement, no sounds from the trees, no wind, just silence. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing. I stood up and continued down the path, my eyes darting from side to side. That's when I saw it. The camp. It was my camp, but it wasn't. The fire was still burning, but it was smoldering, almost out. The tent was standing, but it was off-center, as if it had been disturbed. I could see footprints in the dirt leading to and from the fire. Large, heavy prints, too large to be mine. Someone had been there. I took a step forward, rifle raised, but then I heard it. A voice, a whisper, carried on the wind. I froze again, the hair on my neck standing up. Jack. It wasn't my name, but it sounded close enough. I didn't think. I turned and ran. The path was uneven and overgrown, and I stumbled several times, but I didn't stop. I had to get out of there. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I emerged from the woods into a clearing. There was a small cabin, old and weathered, standing just at the edge of the trees. I didn't care who lived there or why they were out here. I didn't care about anything anymore. I just needed safety. I ran to the door, pounding on it with my fist. It swung open, and a man, old, rough-looking, stood there, staring at me like I was a madman. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. I collapsed inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. I stayed awake, listening to the sounds of the woods, waiting for something to come. The next morning, I packed up and left. I never spoke to the man in the cabin again. I didn't need to. I was done. The woods were silent as I walked away, but I never forgot the feeling of being watched. The memory still lingers, like a shadow in the back of my mind. And I know one thing for sure. Whatever was out there in those woods wasn't just another hunter. It was something else, something far more dangerous. And I'll never go back. It was the fall of 2015 when I first decided to venture out for a solo camping trip. I had always been an outdoorsy type, growing up in the small town of Clearwater in northern Washington. My friends would often joke about how I disappear into the woods for days at a time, but I'd never been one to shy away from nature. It felt like home, peaceful, untamed, and full of quiet wonders. But this time, something felt different. I hadn't planned on doing a solo camping trip until a series of stressful weeks at work left me craving some solitude. The office was overwhelming, and I needed to get away from the noise, the responsibilities, and the constant pressure. So, I packed up my gear, tent, sleeping bag, fire-starting kit, food, and water, and set out to a secluded spot I had found near the base of Mount Hood. I'd been there a few times before with friends, but this time I was alone. The drive was peaceful enough. The roads winding through forests and small towns offered no signs of trouble. The sun was slowly sinking, casting a golden light through the trees as I made my way along the narrow dirt roads toward my destination. It was an old trail, the kind that rarely saw hikers, tucked away from the main parks and campgrounds. I felt like I had stumbled upon a hidden gem when I first found it, a little oasis of peace. I parked my car at the trailhead around late afternoon. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, and I knew I wouldn't have much time before nightfall. Still, I wasn't concerned. The weather was mild, the forest was quiet, and I was experienced enough to set up camp in the dark if I had to. The trail was overgrown, with brambles scratching at my arms and legs as I made my way deeper into the forest. I was the only one out here. I could tell by the lack of fresh footprints and the silence that stretched across the trees. That's how I liked it. No interruptions, just the sound of my own breath and the occasional bird call. As I reached the clearing where I had decided to set up camp, a sudden unease washed over me. There was nothing in particular that set off the alarm, but my gut told me something wasn't right. The air was too still, too quiet. No rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, just the oppressive weight of silence. I shook it off. It was probably just the remoteness of the area, a kind of primal instinct I hadn't experienced in a while. I unloaded my pack and began setting up the tent, the familiar motions grounding me in the task at hand. As I worked, the sun sank lower, and the light shifted from warm orange to the deep shadows of evening. I made a fire as the darkness settled in around me. The flames crackled, casting a warm glow against the surrounding trees. I cooked a quick meal, the smell of my canned food filling the cool night air. It wasn't much, but it was enough. After eating, I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance in the stillness of the night. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling in the woods, not far from my camp. At first, I thought it was just a deer or a small animal moving through the brush. But then the sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't the kind of noise made by a wild animal. It was deliberate, almost human. A soft crack of branches, a light shuffle of footsteps in the underbrush. My heart rate quickened. I stood up slowly, peering into the darkened woods beyond the glow of the fire. The rustling continued, but there was no sign of what was making the noise. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I had chosen this spot for its solitude, but that meant there was no one else out here. No other campers, no hikers. The silence of the forest was broken only by whatever was moving out there. I grabbed my flashlight from the pack and switched it on, aiming the beam toward the source of the sound. The beam of light cut through the trees, illuminating nothing but the dense underbrush and the distant shadows of towering pines. For a moment, I thought I saw something, just a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, but when I swung the flashlight toward it, nothing was there. I stood still, the beam of the flashlight trembling in my grip as I waited for the sound to come again. Nothing. The woods were silent once more. I laughed quietly to myself, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe it was just my nerves getting the better of me. After all, the forest had its own rhythm, and not every sound had a sinister explanation. I turned the flashlight off and sat back down by the fire, forcing myself to relax. The crackling flames were soothing, and I focused on their warmth to calm my nerves. But the sense of being watched never left me. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. I stayed near the fire, refusing to let it die out. I kept expecting the rustling to return, but it never did. Yet, despite the quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there in the dark, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with me, and I crawled into the tent, pulling the flap closed behind me. I left a small crack in the opening to let in some air, but that only seemed to heighten my sense of vulnerability. The night stretched on, and sleep didn't come easily. Every noise outside the tent made me jump. Every shift of the wind made me listen harder. I had just started to drift off when I heard it again. This time it was louder, closer. A deliberate crunch of leaves and twigs, unmistakably human. I sat up in the darkness of the tent, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was moving, slowly, deliberately, around my campsite. Someone was circling me, staying just out of the reach of the firelight. I could hear their steps crunching in the underbrush, but they never stepped too close to the light. Panic began to rise in my chest. My mind raced. Should I go outside and confront whoever it was? Should I try to flee? But as the minutes passed, I realized there was something worse than being hunted. It was the uncertainty, the not knowing who or what was out there, and the feeling of helplessness that crept in as I waited in the darkness, paralyzed by fear. I thought about calling for help, but there was no cell signal out here. I was completely isolated, with no way to reach anyone. If something went wrong, it would be just me and whoever or whatever was out there in the woods with me. I waited for what felt like hours, the fear gnawing at me with each passing second. The noises stopped eventually, and I wasn't sure whether it was a relief or a deeper terror. Had whoever it was finally left, or were they just waiting for the right moment to strike? When dawn finally broke, I was still awake, my body tense and exhausted. The first light of day pierced through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The sounds of the night seemed to fade with the morning light, but the unease lingered. I waited for the campfire to die out before I gathered my things. There was no sign of anyone or anything in the area. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to indicate that anything had been out there at all. I packed up quickly, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety in my stomach. The woods felt emptier now, as if the night had drained them of life. The strange, unsettling experience had left me shaken, but I wasn't going to let it ruin my trip. I had come here to find peace, and I wasn't going to let a few strange noises scare me away. But I never returned to that campsite again. I don't know what happened that night or who or what was out there in the woods with me. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it was something more sinister. But the fear I felt that night was real, and I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling of being watched from the darkness, alone in the heart of the forest. And as I drove home, I couldn't shake the thought, what if it wasn't over? What if someone was still out there waiting? It's a thought that still haunts me to this day. It was supposed to be an escape, a peaceful break from the chaos of city life, a chance to reconnect with nature and myself. I had rented a small camping spot in a remote part of France, near a dense forest that stretched out into the hills. I was tired, exhausted even, from the grind of work and city living. The thought of being out there, in the open air, with nothing but the sound of trees swaying in the wind and birds calling from a distance, felt like the perfect solution. But as I sat in the tent that night, alone and listening to the quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The day had been perfect. The weather was mild, with the sun shining bright above. The campfire crackled while I made my dinner, a simple meal of canned beans and sausage, all washed down with a bottle of cheap red wine I had picked up from the local shop before heading out. I hadn't seen a soul all day, not one other camper or hiker. I had arrived in the late afternoon, set up my tent, and then wandered around the forest trails, enjoying the serenity. But now, as darkness began to fall and the woods around me turned into a blur of shadows, I started to feel a strange sense of unease. It wasn't the isolation that bothered me. It was something else, something in the air. It was thick, damp, and cool as the night settled in. The trees, tall and looming, seemed to close in around me, their branches creaking in the light breeze. As I sat near the fire, the light of the flames flickering, I couldn't help but notice how quickly the world outside the reach of the fire seemed to vanish into an endless blackness. I tried to shake off the feeling, blaming it on the fact that I was alone in such a vast and empty space. I had brought a flashlight, of course, and it sat beside me, shining a weak beam out into the dark. But the forest, dense with underbrush and towering trees, felt suffocating. It was like the darkness was alive, crawling, breathing, pushing in on me. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I convinced myself that it was just wildlife, rabbits, maybe deer, maybe a fox or two. But the longer I sat, the more I felt like I was being watched. It was around midnight when I decided to head into the tent for bed. I didn't need to be out here any longer than necessary. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way to the tent, quickly unzipping the entrance. Inside, the small space was cramped but cozy enough for the night. I lay down on my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the odd feeling of being observed. But as I stared at the ceiling of the tent, I realized I couldn't stop myself from listening to the sounds of the night. The wind had picked up now, howling through the trees, but there was something else, too. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like footsteps, but not from an animal. No, this was too deliberate, too heavy. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps, slow but distinct, circled around my camp, just outside the reach of the firelight. My heart began to race. Could be a hiker or another camper, right? But why would anyone be out here at this hour, especially in this remote spot? I grabbed the flashlight from beside me, trying to steady my hands. My thoughts raced as I ran through possible explanations, but none of them felt comforting. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and poked my head out, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, a flash of movement. It was gone before I could fully focus, but something or someone had just moved through the trees, just beyond the firelight. My pulse quickened, and I quickly zipped the tent back up. My mind was reeling. There was no way I was imagining things. I had seen something, but what? I stayed still for a while, listening intently, but the footsteps had stopped. The wind picked up again, but the silence that followed felt even more oppressive. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. It had to be a deer or maybe a raccoon, I told myself. My heart rate slowed, and I tried to push the thoughts from my mind. But the moment I relaxed, there was another sound, this time much closer, just outside the tent. I froze again, wide-eyed, every muscle in my body tensed. It wasn't the wind this time, not a random animal. No, this was deliberate. Someone was out there. The rustling stopped, and for a few seconds, there was only silence. Then, a voice, a whisper, soft and breathy, like it was right at the edge of the tent, just outside. It sent a shiver down my spine. The whisper wasn't in French or English. It sounded like a strange, guttural murmur, the kind you might hear in a dream when you're too tired to wake. I didn't know what to do. The flashlight felt useless now, just another thing that would give away my position. I lay completely still, trying to breathe quietly, hoping whoever, or whatever, was out there wouldn't hear me. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one heavier than the last. Then, without warning, the ground outside the tent shifted. Someone or something was circling it again. Slowly, deliberately, I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, the brush of branches against skin, the faintest shuffle of shoes on the forest floor. My stomach dropped. I had to make a decision. Either I stayed here, frozen in place, or I tried to get out of this situation. Somehow. But how? The idea of running seemed insane. The only thing I could do was wait, hope that whatever was out there wasn't planning to hurt me. That's what I told myself, anyway. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The silence returned, more profound than before. I waited for what felt like hours, listening to the soft rustle of the trees, the occasional crack of a branch. But there was no more movement, no more footsteps. Had it gone away? Had I imagined it all? I lay there, unable to sleep, for what felt like the longest night of my life. By morning, the forest was still. The sky was overcast, the light dim, casting long shadows over the campsite. The air had a damp chill to it, and I felt an unease in my chest, the remnants of a restless night. I slowly unzipped the tent, keeping my eyes on the woods around me. But there was no sign of anyone or anything. The campsite was undisturbed. My fire pit was cold. The remnants of the previous night's embers nothing more than a faint memory. I packed up quickly, eager to leave. My mind was still racing, unsure of what exactly I had experienced, but there was no way I could stay another night. I drove back to the nearest town, the unease in my gut never fully dissipating. It had been a strange and unsettling experience, but as time passed, I couldn't help but wonder if I had simply been spooked by the isolation. Maybe it was just the solitude getting to me, or maybe, just maybe, there had been someone out there in the woods watching me for reasons I would never understand. Either way, I never went camping in that spot again. The memory of those footsteps, of that eerie, suffocating feeling, would stay with me forever, a reminder of the dark side of solitude and the wildness that can lurk just out of sight in the heart of nature. And as I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure standing at the edge of the forest, still watching. But there was nothing there, just the empty road, stretching on and on into the unknown.